In the humid depths of Louisiana's plantation country, where Spanish moss drapes like funeral shrouds over centuries-old oak trees, stands the remnants of what locals once called Whitmore Estate. For over 170 years, this crumbling mansion has carried whispers of a darkness so profound that 3 generations of the same family met inexplicable ends within its walls. The house, built in 1849 by tobacco merchant Cornelius Whitmore, became the center of a systematic horror that bound enslaved families in chains far more sinister than iron shackles. Local historians discovered in 2024 that the estate's foundation was built upon a network of underground chambers, designed not for storage, but for a breeding program so methodical and cruel that it defied every moral boundary of its time. Handwritten ledgers found behind false walls reveal detailed records of forced pairings, infant separations, and psychological experiments that treated human beings like livestock in a grotesque agricultural enterprise. The whispers weren't just folklore. They were the voices of the forgotten, rising from beneath floorboards where children were hidden during selections, echoing through halls where mothers last saw their babies, and reverberating in rooms where 3 generations of the Whitmore family died under circumstances that local authorities deliberately obscured from public records. What makes this case particularly haunting is how the trauma seemed to follow bloodlines, like a hereditary curse, affecting not only the enslaved families, but consuming the Whitmore lineage itself, as if the very walls had absorbed so much suffering that they began to exact their own justice. 170 years ago, in an isolated corner of Louisiana's tobacco-growing region, military records and local courthouse documents mentioned a case so disturbing that it ended up buried in bureaucratic silence. The Whitmore family vanished from official records after 1851, but their absence left scars deep in the community's memory. The silence marked generations with a trauma so profound that only now are we beginning to uncover what truly happened behind those moss-covered walls. Before we continue, subscribe and hit the notification bell. Here we unearth secrets buried by official history and give voice to what was silenced. Cornelius Whitmore arrived in Louisiana in 1848, with a fortune built on tobacco trading and a vision that would prove to be his family's ultimate destruction. Unlike other plantation owners who focused on crop production, Whitmore saw human beings as his primary commodity. The 2,400-acre estate he purchased came with 37 enslaved individuals, but within months that number had grown to over 90. The speed of this expansion puzzled neighboring planters, who assumed Whitmore was simply purchasing more workers from New Orleans slave markets. What they didn't know was that Cornelius had designed his entire operation around what he coldly referred to in his private correspondence as human husbandry, a systematic breeding program that treated enslaved women and children like breeding stock. The house itself became a monument to this horrific enterprise. Built with thick walls and soundproof chambers, it featured a series of underground rooms connected by narrow tunnels. Local contractors who worked on the construction later reported strange requests: rooms with no windows, heavy locks on interior doors, and a basement level that seemed to extend far beyond what any normal storage would require. Martha Whitmore, Cornelius's wife, initially resisted her husband's plans. Letters discovered in 2024 reveal her growing horror as she realized the true purpose of their agricultural experiment. In one particularly chilling correspondence to her sister in Charleston, she wrote, "The sounds that rise from below our floors at night. I fear we have built our home atop hell itself." But resistance proved futile. By 1849, the Whitmore estate had become a carefully orchestrated nightmare. Enslaved families were separated based on Cornelius's arbitrary breeding charts. Children as young as 12 were forced into pairings designed to produce what he considered optimal offspring. Mothers were isolated from their babies within days of birth, creating a systematic destruction of family bonds that went far beyond the already horrific norms of slavery. The psychological torture was methodical. Enslaved individuals were given numbers instead of names in Whitmore's ledgers. Women were categorized by their reproductive potential. Men were selected purely for physical characteristics that Cornelius believed would produce strong workers. The human cost of this system created a level of trauma that seemed to seep into the very foundations of the house. Local records from neighboring plantations began noting strange occurrences as early as 1850. Overseer reports mentioned unnatural sounds coming from the Whitmore property at night. Several enslaved people from nearby estates claimed to see lights in the mansion's windows at all hours, accompanied by what they described as weeping that carried on the wind. The whispers began almost immediately. Workers in the fields reported hearing voices calling their names when no one was present. Children spoke of seeing figures in white moving through the house at dawn. Even Martha Whitmore began documenting in her diary what she called conversations with the walls, sounds that seemed to come from within the house's structure itself. What made the situation even more sinister was Cornelius's meticulous record-keeping. Every birth, death, separation, and pairing was documented with clinical precision. These ledgers, hidden behind a false wall in the mansion's library, weren't discovered until renovations began in 2024. The detail in these records reveals a mind that had completely dehumanized the people under his control, treating their lives like entries in an agricultural journal. By the end of 1849, the Whitmore estate housed over 100 enslaved individuals, but the community structure had been completely shattered. Traditional family units had been destroyed and replaced with Cornelius's artificial groupings. The psychological damage was so severe that several enslaved people were reported to have stopped speaking entirely, communicating only through gestures and expressions that seemed to carry the weight of unbearable sorrow. The foundation had been laid for a tragedy that would consume not only the enslaved community, but the Whitmore family itself. As winter approached in 1849, neighbors began reporting that the lights in the mansion never went out, and the sounds emanating from the property had grown so disturbing that some families moved away from the area entirely. The whispers were only the beginning. The true horror of Whitmore Estate revealed itself in what Cornelius euphemistically called the evaluation chambers, a series of underground rooms where enslaved individuals were subjected to examinations that stripped away every shred of human dignity. These rooms, discovered during the 2024 renovation, contained restraining devices, measuring instruments, and detailed charts that mapped out breeding combinations with the cold precision of livestock management. Archaeological evidence uncovered in these chambers tells a story of systematic dehumanization that went beyond anything previously documented in Louisiana plantation records. Iron rings bolted to walls, examination tables with leather restraints, and walls covered in chalk markings that tracked physical characteristics reveal the methodical nature of Cornelius's breeding program. The selection process typically occurred every 3 months. Enslaved individuals were brought to these underground rooms in groups, separated by age and gender. Children as young as 10 were subjected to physical examinations that determined their future roles within Cornelius's twisted system. Young women were evaluated for reproductive potential, while men were assessed purely for the physical traits Cornelius believed would produce strong offspring. Martha Whitmore's diary entries from this period reveal her growing psychological deterioration as she witnessed her husband's program. "I cannot sleep for the sounds that rise from below," she wrote in February 1850. "The weeping has become constant, as if the very earth beneath our home has learned to mourn." Her words prove that even she, complicit in the system through her silence, was being consumed by the weight of what was happening in her own home. The most disturbing aspect of these selection rooms was how they were designed to break psychological bonds between family members. Parents were forced to watch as their children were evaluated and categorized. Siblings were separated based on arbitrary physical characteristics. The trauma of these separations was so severe that many enslaved individuals simply stopped responding to their given names, retreating into a silence that seemed to protect what remained of their inner selves. Cornelius documented every detail of these selections with obsessive precision. His ledgers, written in a code that took historians months to decipher, reveal the extent of his psychological manipulation. Families were deliberately separated to prevent the formation of emotional bonds that might interfere with his breeding program. Children were moved between different living quarters regularly to ensure they never developed strong attachments to parental figures. The underground chambers themselves became a source of the house's supernatural reputation. Multiple layers of brick and stone created perfect sound insulation, but they also seemed to trap something more than just noise. Workers who entered these rooms during the 2024 renovation reported sudden temperature drops, unexplained sounds, and an overwhelming sense of despair that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. By spring 1850, neighboring plantations began noting unusual behavior among their own enslaved populations. People who had relatives at Whitmore Estate stopped speaking about their family members entirely. Others began displaying symptoms that local doctors couldn't explain. Sudden periods of catatonic silence, nightmares that caused screaming fits, and a refusal to enter enclosed spaces without visible exits. The psychological impact extended beyond the enslaved community. Cornelius himself began showing signs of mental deterioration that his wife documented with growing concern. His obsession with his breeding charts grew so intense that he spent entire nights in the selection rooms, making calculations and adjustments to his pairings. Martha noted that he had stopped referring to the enslaved individuals by even their numbers, instead calling them simply units in his research. The selection process created a hierarchy of trauma within the enslaved community. Those chosen for breeding were subjected to different horrors than those designated as general laborers. Children identified as having superior characteristics were separated from their families entirely and raised in isolation to prevent what Cornelius called emotional contamination. This systematic destruction of human connections created a community of people who had learned that love itself was dangerous. Local church records from 1850 reveal that several white families in the area began requesting special prayers for the souls lost to darkness. While these entries were deliberately vague, they suggest that knowledge of Cornelius's program extended beyond his property. The complicity of silence from the broader community created a web of moral corruption that seemed to spread outward from the estate like an infection. The selection rooms also served another purpose that only became clear when historians examined the architectural plans. The underground chambers were connected to a series of tunnels that led to different parts of the plantation. These passages allowed Cornelius to move people without them being seen from above ground, creating the impression that individuals had simply vanished when they were actually being relocated to different areas of his program. As 1850 progressed, the sounds emanating from Whitmore Estate grew so disturbing that neighboring families began avoiding the roads that passed near the property. Local folklore from this period speaks of voices that seemed to come from beneath the earth itself, calling out names of people who had disappeared. Children in nearby households reported nightmares about underground rooms filled with weeping voices. The selection rooms had become more than just chambers of horror. They had transformed into a focal point for trauma so intense that it seemed to warp the very nature of the space around them. The whispers that Martha Whitmore first noticed had grown into something that felt alive, feeding on the pain that saturated every brick and stone. In the hidden corners of Whitmore Estate, where Spanish moss filtered sunlight into ghostly patterns, lived the women who bore the heaviest burden of Cornelius's breeding program. These mothers, forced into systematic reproduction and then separated from their children within days of birth, created a network of resistance that existed purely in whispered names and remembered faces. Their story reveals how love persisted, even in the face of methodical dehumanization. Now I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're hearing this story. I want to know how far these silenced accounts reach. The maternal quarters at Whitmore Estate were designed with clinical efficiency. Located in a separate wing of the slave quarters, these rooms housed women designated for reproductive purposes. Each room contained multiple beds, but privacy was deliberately eliminated. Cornelius believed that removing personal space would prevent the formation of individual identities that might interfere with his program. Archaeological evidence from the 2024 excavation revealed the ingenious ways these women preserved their maternal bonds despite systematic separation. Hidden beneath floorboards, researchers found small cloth dolls, each containing a lock of hair and a piece of fabric from a child's clothing. These primitive keepsakes represented a form of resistance that Cornelius never suspected. Mothers creating tangible connections to children they might never see again. Sarah, whose name appears most frequently in Cornelius's breeding ledgers, became a central figure in this underground network of maternal resistance. Designated as Unit 23 in official records, she gave birth to 7 children between 1849 and 1852. Each infant was removed from her care within 3 days of birth, but Sarah developed a system of marking her children that allowed her to identify them even years later. The marking system was both simple and heartbreaking. Sarah would use her fingernails to create tiny scratches behind her newborn's ears, marks so small that overseers never noticed them. Years later, when these children worked in the fields, she could identify her own offspring by these nearly invisible scars. Other mothers adopted similar techniques, creating a secret language of recognition that persisted despite every attempt to erase family bonds. Martha Whitmore's diary reveals her growing awareness of this maternal network. "I observe the women in the quarters," she wrote in June 1850, "and I see a communication that exists without words. They have found ways to love that my husband's system cannot touch." Her recognition of this resistance seemed to intensify her own psychological breakdown as she realized the humanity her husband was trying to eliminate. The trauma of systematic child separation created psychological effects that medical historians are only now beginning to understand. Women in the maternal quarters developed what contemporary accounts described as silent grieving, a form of mourning that was expressed through physical symptoms rather than vocal expressions. Many stopped eating regularly. Others developed repetitive behaviors like rocking or humming that seemed to provide comfort in the absence of their children. But within this framework of trauma, remarkable acts of solidarity emerged. Women who had lost children would often adopt the grief of others, creating a communal mourning system that distributed emotional pain across the entire group. When one mother was too devastated to function, others would quietly assume her work responsibilities, protecting her from punishment while she processed her loss. The underground chambers contained evidence of another form of maternal resistance that shocked researchers. Hidden caches of food, carefully preserved and stored, revealed that mothers were systematically saving portions of their meager rations. These supplies weren't for their own survival. They were being set aside for children who might return, for escape attempts, or for other mothers who had just given birth and needed extra nutrition. Cornelius's records show his growing frustration with what he termed emotional contamination among the mothers. Despite his efforts to break maternal bonds, women continued to display behaviors that indicated they remembered their children. Some would stand at specific locations in the fields where they could see the children's quarters. Others developed subtle hand signals that allowed them to communicate across distances without alerting overseers. The psychological impact of this systematic separation extended beyond individual trauma to create a form of collective memory that transcended generations. Mothers who couldn't care for their own children began sharing stories about babies they had lost, creating oral histories that preserved the memory of children who had been deliberately erased from official records. Local medical records from the period reveal an unusual pattern of illness among women at Whitmore Estate. Doctors called to treat enslaved individuals noted symptoms they couldn't explain. Episodes of catatonic staring, sudden violent outbursts followed by days of silence, and physical ailments that had no apparent medical cause. Modern psychiatrists recognize these as classic symptoms of severe trauma, but 1850s medicine had no framework for understanding psychological injury. The mothers' quarters also became the epicenter of the supernatural phenomena that gave the house its reputation. Multiple witnesses reported seeing figures of women walking through the rooms at night, searching for something that could never be found. The sounds that so disturbed Martha Whitmore seemed to originate from this area. Soft crying that occurred at regular intervals, as if following the rhythm of a lullaby. Perhaps most remarkably, the maternal network created a form of historical record that survived long after Cornelius's official documents were hidden. Oral traditions passed down through generations of descendants preserved the names, birth dates, and characteristics of children who appear nowhere in written records. This verbal history became the only way these families could maintain connections across the deliberate separations imposed by the breeding program. As 1850 drew to a close, the mothers at Whitmore Estate had created something Cornelius never anticipated. A form of love so resilient that it survived every attempt at elimination, growing stronger in response to systematic oppression. Within the twisted hierarchy of Whitmore Estate, no group suffered more systematic erasure than the children born into Cornelius's breeding program. These youngsters, separated from their mothers within days of birth, were subjected to an experimental form of child rearing designed to eliminate emotional attachments and create what Cornelius referred to in his notes as optimal human resources. The 2024 archaeological discovery of a separate children's compound revealed the full extent of this systematic abuse. The children's quarters, hidden in a grove of oak trees approximately half a mile from the main plantation buildings, operated according to principles that stripped away every aspect of normal childhood development. Babies were raised in communal cribs, attended to by rotating caregivers who were specifically instructed never to form individual bonds with specific children. This deliberate prevention of attachment created psychological damage that affected these children for their entire lives. Cornelius's experimental approach to child rearing was documented in ledgers that read like scientific research notes rather than records of human development. Children were identified by numbers rather than names, categorized by physical characteristics, and subjected to regular evaluations that determined their future roles within the plantation system. Those deemed suitable for breeding were separated from those designated as general laborers, creating artificial hierarchies among children who should have been playing together. The discovery of the children's compound in 2024 revealed architectural features that demonstrated the methodical nature of this psychological abuse. Sleeping areas were designed to prevent privacy, long rows of small beds with no personal storage space. Play areas were monitored from observation points that allowed overseers to watch every interaction. Even the layout of the buildings was designed to eliminate hiding places where children might form private friendships. Martha Whitmore's diary entries reveal her horror as she learned about the children's treatment. "I walked to the grove today," she wrote in August 1850, and witnessed children who move like shadows, speaking in whispers, never laughing as children should. My husband has created something that defies God's plan for innocence. Her observations provide crucial evidence about the psychological state of these systematically abused children. The most disturbing aspect of the children's compound was what Cornelius called emotional conditioning, a program designed to eliminate natural human responses to separation and loss. Children who cried for their mothers were subjected to isolation punishments. Those who formed friendships with other children were deliberately separated. Any display of normal emotional attachment was treated as a behavioral problem that required correction. Archaeological evidence suggests that the children developed their own forms of resistance that adult overseers never detected. Small toys carved from wood scraps hidden under floorboards revealed that these children were creating their own sources of comfort, despite every attempt to eliminate personal possessions. Secret hiding places contained collections of interesting stones, dried flowers, and other natural objects that children had gathered as a way of maintaining some sense of individual identity. The educational program within the children's compound was designed purely for utility rather than human development. Children learned only skills that would make them more valuable as enslaved laborers. Basic arithmetic for measuring crops, enough literacy to follow written instructions, and physical training that built strength for field work. No attention was given to emotional development, creative expression, or the formation of personal identity. Local church records from the period contained cryptic references to special prayers being offered for the innocent ones lost to darkness. While these entries don't specifically mention Whitmore Estate, their timing coincides with the peak years of Cornelius's experimental child-rearing program. The broader community's awareness of something wrong with children in the area suggests that knowledge of these abuses extended beyond the plantation boundaries. The psychological impact of this systematic childhood trauma created lasting effects that appeared in Cornelius's own documentation. Children raised in the compound displayed what he noted as unusual behavioral patterns, an inability to form emotional attachments, responses to stress that seemed more like trained animals than human children, and a form of communication that relied heavily on gestures rather than verbal expression. Perhaps most heartbreaking was the discovery of what researchers called memory preservation attempts, hidden throughout the children's quarters. Small collections of items that seemed to represent absent family members, pieces of fabric that might have belonged to mothers, small stones arranged in patterns that could represent siblings, and crude drawings hidden in walls that showed figures holding hands. These artifacts reveal that despite every attempt to eliminate family memory, children continued to search for connections to the people they had lost. The compound also contained evidence of the supernatural phenomena that began manifesting around the children. Overseer reports mentioned children speaking to invisible companions, playing games that seemed to involve partners who weren't present, and gathering in groups to listen to sounds that adults couldn't hear. Rather than recognizing these as responses to trauma, Cornelius documented them as evidence that his emotional conditioning program was creating enhanced sensitivity to environmental stimuli. As the children in the compound grew older, they were gradually introduced to the adult enslaved community, but the psychological damage from their early years made normal social integration nearly impossible. Many never learned to form close relationships. Others displayed behaviors that seemed more suited to institutional life than human community, and virtually all carried a form of emotional numbness that affected their ability to experience joy or spontaneous affection. The children's compound represented the most complete expression of Cornelius's vision, a place where human beings could be raised like crops without the emotional complications that normal family structures created. But the resistance these children showed and the psychological damage they sustained would ultimately contribute to the downfall of his entire system. Hidden behind a false wall in Whitmore Estate's library, the 2024 renovation team discovered what historians now consider the most disturbing documentation of systematic human breeding ever found in American plantation records. Cornelius Whitmore's breeding charts, dozens of detailed diagrams that tracked genetic lines like livestock pedigrees, revealed the true scope of his attempt to engineer human beings according to his own twisted vision of genetic superiority. These charts, drawn on specially prepared parchment and protected in leather portfolios, mapped out breeding combinations across multiple generations. Each enslaved individual was represented by a numbered symbol, with lines connecting them to show planned reproductive pairings. Physical characteristics, work abilities, and even personality traits were noted in margins, creating a dehumanizing catalogue that treated people like experimental subjects. The sophistication of Cornelius's record-keeping system revealed a mind that had completely divorced itself from the humanity of the people under his control. Color-coded symbols indicated different categories of individuals: red for prime-breeding females, blue for males selected for genetic characteristics, green for children being evaluated for future roles, and black for those deemed unsuitable for reproduction but valuable for labor. What made these charts particularly horrifying was their projection into future generations. Cornelius had planned breeding combinations extending 20 years into the future, calculating how specific pairings would produce offspring with desired characteristics. Children who hadn't even been born yet were already designated for specific roles within his system, their entire lives mapped out according to their anticipated genetic contributions. Martha Whitmore's discovery of these charts in late 1850 marked the beginning of her complete psychological breakdown. Her diary entry from November reads, "I have seen the devil's mathematics written in my husband's hand. He has reduced God's children to numbers on a page, planned their lives like a farmer plans his crops. I fear I am living with a man who has lost his soul entirely." The charts also revealed the extent to which Cornelius was manipulating existing family structures to serve his breeding program. Siblings were deliberately separated to prevent what he called genetic redundancy. And parents and children were kept apart to eliminate emotional bonds that might interfere with his planned pairings. Even grandparents were relocated to different areas of the plantation to ensure that traditional family wisdom couldn't be passed down to younger generations. Archaeological evidence suggests that some enslaved individuals became aware of the breeding chart's existence and developed their own forms of resistance. Hidden markings found throughout the plantation buildings appear to be a counter-documentation system, secret symbols that tracked real family relationships despite Cornelius's attempts to erase them. These markings allowed people to maintain awareness of their true biological connections, even when official records deliberately obscured them. The charts included disturbing notations about what Cornelius termed psychological breeding, attempts to create personality traits through selective reproduction. He believed that characteristics like compliance, physical strength, and even intelligence could be enhanced through careful genetic selection. Children born from specific pairings were subjected to different treatment programs designed to reinforce these supposedly inherited traits. Local medical records from the period reveal that Cornelius consulted with several doctors about his breeding theories, seeking scientific validation for his experimental program. While most physicians refused to participate directly, their correspondence shows that the broader medical community was aware of unusual practices at Whitmore Estate. Some doctors even provided advice about nutrition and healthcare designed to optimize reproductive success. The breeding charts also documented what Cornelius called failed experiments, pairings that didn't produce the results he expected. These failures were subjected to different treatment, often being separated from the general population and assigned to particularly harsh labor conditions. The psychological impact of being labeled a genetic failure created an additional layer of trauma for individuals already suffering under the broader system of abuse. Perhaps most disturbing was the discovery that Cornelius had been corresponding with similar plantation owners in other states, sharing his breeding theories and comparing results. Letters found alongside the charts revealed a network of individuals engaged in comparable experimental programs, suggesting that Whitmore Estate was part of a broader pattern of systematic human breeding that extended across the antebellum South. The charts included detailed medical information that Cornelius gathered through forced examinations and observations. Height, weight, physical anomalies, and even dental characteristics were recorded for each individual. This medical surveillance created a form of scientific racism that justified his experimental program by treating enslaved people as subjects for genetic research rather than human beings deserving of basic dignity. As his program progressed, Cornelius became increasingly obsessed with documenting results that proved his theories correct. When reality didn't match his genetic predictions, he altered his charts retroactively, creating a fictional version of success that justified continuing the program. This self-deception revealed a man who had become so invested in his experimental system that he lost the ability to recognize its fundamental failures. The breeding charts also revealed the financial calculations behind Cornelius's program. Each individual was assigned a monetary value based on their role within his breeding system, with detailed projections showing expected returns on investment from specific genetic combinations. The complete commodification of human reproduction showed how thoroughly he had integrated profit motives with his pseudo-scientific theories. By 1851, the breeding charts had become more than documentation. They had transformed into an obsessive delusion that consumed Cornelius's ability to function normally. His wife noted that he spent entire nights revising his calculations, convinced that perfect genetic combinations were always just one more pairing away. March 15, 1851. Began like any other dawn at Whitmore Estate, but by nightfall something fundamental had shifted in the supernatural atmosphere that had haunted the plantation for nearly 2 years. The constant whispering that had tormented Martha Whitmore and disturbed neighboring families suddenly ceased, replaced by a silence so complete that several witnesses described it as unnatural and more frightening than the sounds had been. If this story has already gripped you, leave a like. It helps the story of the Whitmore family reach more people. The events of that night began with what Martha Whitmore described in her diary as a gathering that seemed to organize itself. Throughout the day, enslaved individuals across the plantation had been moving in patterns that appeared random to overseers, but suggested coordination to anyone watching carefully. Small groups congregated near specific buildings, dispersed when supervisors approached, then reformed in different locations. Archaeological evidence from the 2024 excavation suggests that this gathering represented the culmination of months of secret planning among the enslaved community. Hidden caches of tools, preserved food, and makeshift weapons discovered throughout the plantation grounds indicate that resistance had been organizing despite the systematic psychological abuse designed to prevent exactly this kind of coordination. Cornelius, completely absorbed in his breeding charts and genetic calculations, failed to notice the changing atmosphere among the people under his control. His obsession with documenting genetic outcomes had blinded him to the human reality of the trauma he was inflicting. Martha's diary reveals that she tried to warn her husband about the tension she sensed, but he dismissed her concerns as feminine hysteria and refused to consider that his experimental subjects might be planning resistance. The actual confrontation began around midnight, when Cornelius was discovered in the underground selection chambers by a group of enslaved individuals who had gained access through the tunnel system he himself had constructed. The exact details of what occurred in those chambers remained hidden for over 170 years, but the 2024 renovation uncovered physical evidence that suggests a violent confrontation that left bloodstains on walls and signs of a desperate struggle. What made this night particularly significant was not just the physical confrontation, but the complete breakdown of the psychological control system that Cornelius had spent 2 years constructing. The artificial separations, the systematic destruction of family bonds, and the deliberate elimination of individual identity had created so much accumulated trauma that when resistance finally emerged, it carried the force of collective rage that had been suppressed for too long. Martha Whitmore's account of that night reveals her own psychological transformation as she witnessed the collapse of her husband's system. "I heard sounds from below that were not whispers but roars," she wrote, "as if the very earth had found its voice and was crying out in fury. I knew that justice had finally come for the sins we had committed against God's children." The underground chambers, which had been the epicenter of systematic abuse, became the focal point for a reckoning that seemed to draw its power from the accumulated suffering of everyone who had been tortured in those spaces. Witnesses described sounds that seemed to come from the walls themselves, not the whispers that had haunted the house, but voices that spoke with clarity and determination. Local records from neighboring plantations reveal that the events at Whitmore Estate were observed from a distance by several families who reported seeing unusual lights and hearing sounds that carried across the countryside. One overseer noted in his log that the very air seemed to vibrate with energy, and that livestock on nearby properties became agitated simultaneously, as if responding to something that humans could barely perceive. The morning of March 16th revealed the complete transformation of Whitmore Estate's power structure. Cornelius was found in the library, surrounded by his breeding charts, but in a catatonic state that local doctors couldn't explain. He showed no physical injuries, but he had apparently lost the ability to speak or recognize his surroundings. The man who had controlled every aspect of other people's lives had been reduced to a psychological shell. Perhaps most significantly, the systematic separations that had defined life at the plantation began dissolving overnight. Mothers found their children, siblings were reunited, and families that had been deliberately scattered started reconstructing themselves according to their true relationships rather than Cornelius's artificial arrangements. The breeding charts that had mapped out genetic futures were discovered torn to pieces and scattered throughout the house. The enslaved community's response to this sudden freedom revealed both the depth of trauma they had endured and their remarkable resilience in the face of systematic abuse. Rather than fleeing immediately, many individuals spent time searching for family members, gathering personal items that had been confiscated, and performing what appeared to be memorial rituals for those who had died under Cornelius's program. Martha Whitmore's diary entries from the days following March 15th reveal her growing awareness that the supernatural phenomena she had experienced were connected to the resistance that had been building among the enslaved community. "The whispers were never ghosts," she wrote. "They were the voices of people planning their freedom, and I was too blind to understand what I was hearing." The silence that replaced the whispers wasn't emptiness. It was peace. For the first time in nearly 2 years, Whitmore Estate experienced quiet that came from the absence of suffering rather than the suppression of voices. Neighboring families noted that the disturbing atmosphere that had surrounded the plantation seemed to lift overnight, as if a dark cloud had finally moved on. The night the whispering stopped marked the end of Cornelius Whitmore's experimental program, but it was only the beginning of a reckoning that would consume his entire family. The destruction of Cornelius Whitmore's breeding program in March 1851 should have ended the horror story of Whitmore Estate, but instead it marked the beginning of a different kind of nightmare, one that seemed to follow bloodlines with supernatural precision. Over the next 3 decades, every member of the Whitmore family would meet unexplained ends, as if the trauma they had inflicted on others had transformed into a force that demanded payment across generations. Martha Whitmore was the first to recognize the pattern. Her diary entries from 1851 reveal a woman increasingly convinced that her family was being systematically punished for their crimes against humanity. "The children we separated now watch from the shadows," she wrote in May 1851, "and they have learned our faces. They remember what we took from them, and they are taking it back one by one." Cornelius never recovered from his catatonic state following the events of March 15th. Local medical records describe a man who had lost all higher brain function while retaining basic physical capabilities. He could eat, walk, and perform simple tasks, but he showed no recognition of people or places, no emotional responses, and no ability to communicate. It was as if his capacity for human connection had been surgically removed, leaving only biological functions. The parallels between Cornelius's condition and the psychological damage he had inflicted on enslaved children were too precise to ignore. Just as he had tried to create people without emotional attachments, he had become a person incapable of forming any human connections. Just as he had reduced others to numbers and functions, he had been reduced to purely biological existence, without personality or consciousness. Martha's attempts to care for her husband revealed the depth of psychological damage that had accumulated within their household. "He looks at me as if I am furniture," she wrote, with no more recognition than he showed the people he tortured. "I realize now that he lost his humanity long before they took his mind. Perhaps this is simply the external manifestation of what he became internally." The couple's 3 children, who had been away at boarding schools during the worst years of their father's experimental program, returned home to find a household that had been fundamentally transformed. 17-year-old Marcus, 15-year-old Catherine, and 12-year-old James encountered a father who didn't recognize them, and a mother who spoke constantly about voices only she could hear. Local records reveal that the Whitmore children began experiencing their own supernatural encounters almost immediately upon returning home. Marcus reported seeing figures in his bedroom at night, children who stood silently at the foot of his bed, never speaking but watching with expressions of profound sadness. Catherine complained of hearing babies crying in walls, sounds that seemed to follow her throughout the house, but stopped whenever other people were present. The youngest son, James, developed what Martha described as conversations with invisible companions. He would sit in empty rooms, apparently responding to voices that no one else could hear, sometimes laughing, sometimes crying, but always engaged with presences that remained imperceptible to adults. When questioned about these interactions, he would only say that the lost children were teaching him about their families. As 1851 progressed, each of the Whitmore children began displaying psychological symptoms that seemed specifically designed to mirror the trauma their father had inflicted. Marcus developed an inability to form emotional attachments, treating family members and friends with the same clinical detachment his father had shown toward enslaved people. Catherine became obsessed with documentation, creating detailed lists and charts about household activities that eerily resembled Cornelius's breeding records. The supernatural phenomena that had haunted the house during Cornelius's experimental program returned with renewed intensity, but now they seemed focused specifically on family members. Martha documented instances of doors slamming shut when her children tried to leave rooms, mysterious illnesses that struck during family gatherings, and accidents that occurred with suspicious frequency whenever the family was together. Local church records reveal that Martha made increasingly desperate attempts to find spiritual intervention for her family's situation. She consulted with ministers from multiple denominations, seeking prayers, exorcisms, and any form of divine protection that might break what she had become convinced was a supernatural curse. Most clergy refused to become involved after learning about Cornelius's experimental program. The few religious leaders who did attempt to help the Whitmore family reported experiencing their own supernatural encounters during visits to the estate. Reverend Thomas Mitchell documented in his personal journal that during one prayer session, he heard voices of children calling out names and felt a presence so heavy with grief that it became difficult to breathe. By 1852, the pattern of supernatural targeting became impossible to ignore. Each family member was experiencing phenomena that directly related to specific aspects of Cornelius's breeding program. Martha saw mothers searching for children. Marcus encountered fathers who had been separated from their families, Catherine heard babies who had been taken from their mothers, and James played with children who had been denied normal childhoods. The psychological impact of these encounters created a form of inherited trauma that seemed to pass the original sins of the father onto children who had not directly participated in his crimes. The Whitmore children found themselves carrying emotional burdens that belonged to people they had never met, experiencing grief for families they had never known, and feeling guilt for crimes they had not committed. As the supernatural phenomena intensified, Martha began to understand that her family was not being randomly haunted, but systematically educated about the human cost of their privilege. The voices, visions, and mysterious encounters were teaching the Whitmore children about the people their father had destroyed. The supernatural reckoning that began with Cornelius Whitmore's psychological destruction in 1851 continued its methodical work across decades, claiming members of his family with a precision that local records described as unnaturally systematic. By 1875, 3 generations of Whitmores had experienced deaths so unusual that neighboring families began avoiding the estate entirely, convinced that some form of hereditary curse was systematically eliminating the bloodline. Martha Whitmore's death in 1854 marked the second phase of what locals had begun calling the Whitmore curse. Found in the underground chambers where her husband had conducted his breeding program, she appeared to have died of natural causes, but her final diary entry suggested something far more complex was occurring. "They have shown me what I need to see," she wrote, "and now I understand that justice requires payment from every generation that benefited from their suffering." The circumstances surrounding Martha's death revealed the supernatural phenomena had evolved from simple haunting to something resembling a structured form of justice. Witnesses reported that in the weeks before her death, she had begun spending entire days in the underground chambers, apparently engaged in conversations with invisible companions. Neighbors who observed her during this period described a woman who seemed to be receiving detailed instructions about something only she could perceive. Marcus Whitmore, the eldest son, inherited the estate in 1854, but survived only 3 years before meeting an end that local authorities couldn't adequately explain. Found in the children's compound that his father had constructed for his breeding program, Marcus appeared to have died from exposure, but the circumstances made no logical sense. He had been discovered during summer weather in a location only a few hundred yards from the main house, with no apparent reason for being there overnight. What made Marcus's death particularly disturbing were the physical conditions in which he was found. His body was positioned as if he had been playing a children's game, sitting cross-legged in a circle with several small objects arranged around him that appeared to be improvised toys. Local doctors noted that his expression was peaceful, almost childlike, as if he had died while experiencing something pleasant rather than frightening. Catherine Whitmore's death in 1861 continued the pattern of family members dying in locations specifically connected to their father's experimental program. She was discovered in the maternal quarters of the old slave compound, surrounded by the cloth dolls that archaeologists would later identify as keepsakes created by mothers separated from their children. Like her brother, she showed no signs of violence or struggle, but appeared to have simply stopped living while engaged in some form of memorial activity. The youngest son, James, survived longer than his siblings, but experienced what local records described as a living death that paralleled his father's catatonic condition. Beginning in 1862, he gradually lost the ability to form new memories, recognize familiar faces, or maintain coherent conversations. Unlike his father's sudden psychological collapse, James's mental deterioration progressed slowly, as if he was being systematically stripped of different aspects of human consciousness. Local physicians who examined James documented symptoms that didn't match any known medical conditions. He retained perfect physical health while losing cognitive abilities in a specific sequence. First, the ability to recognize individual faces, then the capacity to remember names, followed by the loss of emotional responses to familiar people. It was as if his brain was being deliberately restructured to eliminate the human connections that his father had tried to destroy in others. The second generation of supernatural targeting began with James's children, who started experiencing encounters similar to those their grandparents and parents had described. However, the phenomena affecting James's offspring showed a different pattern. Instead of experiencing terror or confusion, the third generation seemed to be receiving education about their family's history from sources that previous generations had perceived as threatening. James's daughter, Elizabeth, born in 1863, began displaying an unusual knowledge of plantation history that she couldn't have learned from any living source. By age 5, she could recite the names of enslaved individuals who had died decades before her birth, describe the layout of buildings that had been demolished, and provide details about her grandfather's breeding program that had been deliberately hidden from family records. The boy, Cornelius Jr., born in 1865, developed what family members described as inherited memories. The ability to describe events from his grandfather's experimental program as if he had witnessed them personally. These weren't confused childhood fantasies, but detailed, accurate accounts of specific incidents that were later confirmed when historians examined hidden documents during the 2024 renovation. By 1870, the supernatural phenomena at Whitmore Estate had transformed from punishment to instruction. The third generation wasn't being tormented by ghostly encounters. They were being taught about the human cost of their inherited wealth by the very people who had paid that price. The children's supernatural education included not just facts about what had occurred, but emotional understanding of how those events had affected real families. Local church records reveal that Elizabeth and Cornelius Jr. began requesting specific memorial services for enslaved individuals whose names they had learned through their supernatural encounters. They insisted on marking graves that had been deliberately left unmarked, creating memorial stones for people whose existence had been erased from official records, and conducting remembrance ceremonies for families that had been systematically destroyed. The pattern that emerged across 3 generations suggested that the supernatural forces at Whitmore Estate weren't seeking simple revenge, but rather a form of restorative justice that required each generation to understand and acknowledge the human cost of their family's crimes against humanity.